Hey guys, my name is William and I'll be your speaker today. Our topic today is synchronization. So just before this video begins, I would recommend y'all to watch our lectures on fractals, dimensionality, and chaos theory. So these previous lectures that we made would give you a broader understanding of the topic that we're going to be discussing today. Alright, now let's get started. So you guys probably already know this through daily experiences. Our universe and our world is very, very messy. So how can things actually be synchronized? Like, is it even possible? Well, it absolutely is. To begin with, I'll talk about why our world is messy and chaotic like it is today. The second law of thermodynamics states that isolated systems have a natural tendency of becoming more and more disordered. The concept of entropy also connects to this law. I'm sure you guys have heard of entropy in chemistry, physics, or any other type of science course. Entropy is a measure of dispersal and randomness in an isolated system, and it always increases over time. Like, there is literally no possible method of decreasing entropy that is known to man. So, since the universe is an isolated system itself, it must become more and more complex over time. Things will continue to become more and more disordered until essentially the end of the world. Like, it's just gonna keep becoming more complex and more random and more chaotic. That's kind of scary. Another example of why our universe is so complex is chaos theory. If you haven't watched our lecture on chaos theory yet, please be sure to check it out right here. The universe itself is extremely complicated and is made up of several systems that are very disordered and also establish chaotic behavior. Essentially, the behavior of these systems cannot be modeled or predicted. Like, everything is just completely random. But despite all of this, things can still be synchronized. Let me explain how. Let's first understand the concept of frequency. You guys probably have already learned this in physics-related courses. Frequency is essentially the number of waves that passes through a certain point in a certain unit of time. So how does frequency actually relate to synchronization? Well, synchronized objects often have the same frequency, or have resonated frequencies, or frequencies at different harmonics. Harmonics are essentially the multiples of the strongest resonant frequency. I'm sure you guys have heard of the Broughton Suspension Bridge, or at least have heard about the story behind it. In 1831, some British soldiers did not break march on the Broughton Suspension Bridge. They all marched in sync, and in turn, the bridge collapsed under their footsteps. Although no one was killed, several soldiers were injured. This is why, ever since then, soldiers had to break step or break march whenever they needed to cross a bridge. Now, this effect happened because of, you guessed it, synchronization. The frequency of the soldiers' march matched the natural frequency of the bridge, which eventually caused the bridge to vibrate heavily and collapse. The very first example of synchronization can be seen in pendulum clocks, which were developed by Dutch mathematician Christian Huygens. He invented the first ever working pendulum clock in 1656. However, Christian Huygens soon realized that two pendulum clocks mounted on the same support or same system, let's say a wooden board, would eventually synchronize and become coupled oscillators. This was where the concept of synchronization was first born. Entrainment then is another concept where two oscillators will eventually come together, and what am I talking about? Entrainment is also another important concept, where two interacting oscillators in the same system will eventually assume the same period. In this case, entrainment happens because the two pendulum clocks are mounted on the same object. Now that you have a much better understanding of synchronization, let's get back to bridges, because why not? We already know that a march with a frequency that is resonantly synchronized to the bridge's natural frequency will cause the bridge to vibrate heavily and could possibly collapse the bridge as well. However, when civilians, just normal people that aren't in the army, walked on the Millennium Bridge, they still were synchronized, and they still caused the bridge to vibrate. So why is that? Like, they're not walking in the army and they didn't tell each other beforehand to walk in the same pattern. Who would do that? Well, this is simply because a lot of entrainment is happening. people in this case are just acting as oscillators connected by the bridge. The vibration will affect each other and eventually stabilize to become one huge vibration. Hence, this is why the bridge shook rapidly and was immediately closed to the public for another 2 years. Now let's get to the fun part. How can synchronization be portrayed by math?
That was kind of cringe.
Now let's get to the fun part. How can synchronization actually be portrayed by math? The Chromato Model. Don't be intimidated by it. The Chromato Model uses a complicated differential equation to model the synchronization between different oscillators in the same system. The rate of which each oscillator goes around the system is the first term. The other term is representing the sum of the distances from that chosen oscillator to the other oscillators inside the system. The size of the other term is determined by the coupling strength, which is the variable k. Scientists and mathematicians have used this equation to model complicated synchronized systems. Alright, now let's move on to other real-life examples of synchronization. The best example of this is just a crowd applauding. Although people clap at different frequencies, at different speeds, at different wavelengths, all that whatever, they eventually synchronize because they are located beside each other inside the same system, which would be the concert room or whatever the location is. So next time you go to a concert or a big event like, say, a TED Talk or a speech, try to find this type of effect, try to find this phenomenon in real life and see if your claps, see if your applauses actually sync up with each other. Another great example of how synchronization is actually affecting our world are flashing fireflies. I almost said butterflies, jeez. Fireflies flash their lights individually at first, but like clapping, they eventually come into sync. This is again because the fireflies are affected by their neighbors. Yes, peer pressure also applies to fireflies. Can you believe that? If fireflies are affected by their neighbors, they flash sooner. And eventually, this whole flashing sequence becomes a large wave of flashes. So over time, the flashes become waves of synchronized light. The Earth and its moon are actually also surprisingly synchronized to each other. The moon has its own rotational frequency. However, the gravitational attraction of the Earth is stronger on the side of the moon that is closer to the Earth itself. So this in turn either slows up. Dang. So this in turn either slows down or speeds up the rotation of the moon. This process just keeps going on and continues until the moon is tidally locked, or essentially just synchronized with the Earth. Similarly, this also happens with Jupiter and its 3 inner moons, Io, Europa, and Ganymede. So see, the special thing about these moons is that they are not just synced to Jupiter, they are also synchronized amongst themselves. This is because Io, Europa, and Ganymede are in a 4:2:1 ratio of orbital resonance to each other in that order. How cool is that? So the universe isn't that chaotic after all, right? Alright, let's go over what we learned today. Although the universe is extremely chaotic, synchronization and synchronized systems still exist. Synchronization was first discovered by mathematician Christian Huygens through the pendulum clocks that he invented. Synchronization can also be mathematically represented by the Chromato Model. Last but absolutely not least, real-life examples of synchronization also exist, and they're pretty common. This ranges from people marching to clapping to fireflies and even to planets and moons. Yeah, and that's it for today on synchronization. I'm William, and as always, thank you so much for attending today's lecture, and we hope to see you in future videos.